Hi students, thanks for coming back to another lesson about culture with Mrs. T. So in this video, we're going to look at the differences in some of the adjectives that are stuck in front of the word culture for in our chapter 4 reading. We're going to look at folk compared to local cultures and then popular culture, or in some textbooks and sometimes in this one, you'll see it referred to as modern culture. And modern, of course, is one of the words that was used in some of the development theories when we look at industrializing a nation in order to bring about better life circumstances and lifestyles for people. And so popular and modern culture is going to have a whole bunch of elements of urbanization, a whole bunch of elements of development and industrialization and globalism, global consumption especially. But let's start with the small, okay? So when we say folk culture or local culture, like we have up here, they can't be used interchangeably. Down here when we talk about popular and modern culture, you can use those interchangeably. I think it's more common to hear the word popular culture these days than it is modern culture, but you can use those interchangeably. But folk culture and local culture are distinctive. So folk culture typically refers to a particular way of life, the knowledge, the skills, the customs, rituals, beliefs, etc., material, non-material items, that very small populations of people, typically homogeneous societies, that is, there's not a wide variety of points of view, there's not a huge division of labor or lots of different jobs or fields you can go into. There's a small collective of people who have a particular way of life, and it's a small enough population that they pass this way of life from one generation to the next. Now, all culture is learned from one generation to the next generation that follows. So every culture everywhere, from popular culture, modern culture, local culture, these things are learned from a previous generation. But in particular, folk culture stays pretty steady and even over time because it is isolated for the most part and resists influence by outside sources, outside ways of life. And so a folk culture might be something like an indigenous culture of Alaska, or it might be an interior native society in Africa, say in the Congo or in Chad, or some of the cultures that are very isolated from exchange. Maybe in Indonesia or even South America, there are some societies. In New Guinea and in New Zealand and that area of the world, there are some societies that resist outside influence, resist modern, industrialized, developed society. Bhutan, for instance, is a large nation, but you could say that folk culture is something that is preserved in those type places. Okay, so it's different though than local culture. Local culture, we can say, is particular to a certain small town, small area, small region, certain places that have a flavor to them that the community of people who live there intentionally work to preserve, that keeps them distinctive from larger societies' culture around them. So for instance, I lived in Lower Alabama for a while, and there's a little town called Fairhope. And the community government in Fairhope intentionally resists things like big box stores, and instead they want to focus on providing resources and encouraging small mom and pop type businesses to incorporate there. And they have very strict building codes, and they have very strict decoration and budgets for this kind of thing in the downtown area. And so this local community preserves its local culture to resist some of the effects of modernism, some of the effects of global consumptive culture like Walmart and Sam's and Costco and these kinds of things. They can't have those kinds of stores within their community boundaries because they have voted. The community has come together and democratically said, we're not going to do this. And so some people intentionally move to this place because they want to experience that kind of, I don't want to say isolated, but that kind of protected local climate. Okay, so they certainly are part of larger society, but it's sort of segmented off, and the community works together to make sure that some of the ills, let me put that in air quotes, okay, some of the ills of the modern cultural landscape that maybe they don't find appealing are guarded against in their particularly local community. And so that's a significant difference than folk versus local cultures. Okay, so but we're both talking about small, kind of isolated places, right? Because this is isolated as far as mindset goes, right? Like we don't want to include some of the effects of globalization in our local community. And so this is like intentionally guarding against that outside influence. And folk culture can be extremely different. Like they don't accept any sort of participation in the larger geopolitical culture, like the governmental system or taxes or religious beliefs or foodways or any of those kinds of things. They can be extremely distinctive as far as those type things go. Okay, so another type of culture that our book talks about and kind of heavily is popular culture or modern culture. And this is that first world mentality of we need development, we need modernization, we need global consumption of goods and services, we need a lot of change constantly, because if there's fashions that change, as a matter of fact, that's one of the first topics is fashions in your chapter when you're reading about popular culture. We look at urban areas and urban hearth where something like Paris runways, for instance, where high fashion is introduced with price tags of like $12,000, $20,000 for a dress or for a suit. And these kinds of things are out of the reach of the typical person in other urban areas, but we maybe look to this as kind of like an urban god kind of thing, this fashion world. And so there are what's the word? Knockoffs. There are, fashion knockoffs of these styles almost instantaneously. Like the minute that something is walked out on a Paris runway, within an hour there can be mass production of a much cheaper version of this that end up in the Target clothing section at a store near you, right? So that you can participate in this consumptive, very contagious aspect of society. We want this. We want to seem up to date. And these popular and modern cultural components are typical to an urban environment. They first start there. That'll be where the nucleus is for where this aspect of daily life exists. And it's very fluid. It changes over time. The next big thing comes in and we forget the old thing, but it starts in this urban area and it diffuses. So diffusion is a spreading from that center, that nucleus center, or the hearth. We know that word. It's the hearth of where something originates, and then it spreads to other areas. And so even though, you might have, I used the Target clothing section a minute ago. So even though there might be a Target in your local community, maybe a larger city like San Antonio or New Orleans or Atlanta, these are the places where maybe it got them first. And then you had to wait for the shipment to be 2-3 weeks later, right? And so there's a little bit of a time decay or a delay that happens too when you look at the way popular culture diffuses from that urban hearth outward. But popular culture is very specific to first world nations. And as we are going through the rest of the topics in this chapter, I really want you to focus on how folk and local culture often, especially local culture, preserving local culture, this conscious decision to preserve local culture usually has to do with resisting some of the aspects of popular or modern culture within that small little enclave. And folk culture too. Often folk cultures are wiped off the face of the earth if industrialized nations or companies and corporations, like some of the things that we've seen in that movie Stealing Africa that we watched a few weeks ago. Sometimes a folk culture can be wiped off the planet. I'm not exaggerating here. If we, the industrialized people, the corporation, the modernists, the modernization theorists and those folks, if we want that land because we see that we can use it for a profit, or you don't know what to do with it, but I do, and so we're going to make something that it can participate in globalism and the consumption-based economy and cultural ways of life that the first world has, there's very different issues that are important to first world people. Remember, we're talking on a macro scale kind of here when we look at popular culture, but it's lived out by you and me on the micro scale. And so on the micro scale, we have a very different attitude and idea about what's important or necessary in our lives to get by on a daily basis than folks in the third world do. And so one of the things that we're going to be looking at for our Project 3 that's coming up later, little later, don't freak out, I don't have it due yet, but one of the things that we're going to look at for Project 3 is the major difference in mindset of first world versus third world countries and the people within it. So we're going to look at some of that over the course of the semester also. And part of Project 3 will include that kind of commentary about the difference in first world compared to third world nations. But think about that, like put that at the forefront of your mind while you're reading some of this, especially the distinctions between popular and modern culture and folk culture. There are some definite biases toward modernization, industrialization, development, and the Western way of thinking, the Western mindset. And the imposition of a Western way of life on societies everywhere as sort of a solution to social problems that a Western viewpoint identifies as social problems, but maybe they don't, or they don't, for instance. So keep those things in mind as we're reading and talking about more of these topics. Always question everything that we learn about. See you next time. Bye.